Brandon was sure no one would recognize him here. Like all the other branches of his steakhouses that he had been to, none of the other workers, or even the manager, had recognized him. None of them also treated him right, but that's what he expected. He didn't expect everyone to share his vision, because if they did, then he would find it difficult choosing another managing director. What all his managers didn't know was that the managing head, whom they all reported to, had just resigned. Brandon was the owner, founder and CEO of the organization, and he needed a replacement for the just-retired managing director. Jonas, the director that had just retired, was more than just a director. He was a good friend of his and was perfect when it came to the vision that he had for the company. Sometimes, it was almost like he and Jonas were the same person. Hence, it grieved Brandon when Jonas dropped the resignation. But now, he was on a quest to find someone that would at least try to fit the shoes Jonas left behind. Brandon opened the door and allowed the smell of juicily cooked steak and spices to fill his nose. The aroma of the place filled him with a sense of pride, for it was his recipe that produced such heavenly scent. Buddy, you can't be in here. I don't know how he got in," the first waitress to spot him immediately voiced, much to Brandon's expectation. He made a note of wiping the grime from his forehead with his tattered clothes before feigning the most convincing face of plea. He didn't need to feign much. He was genuinely dog-tired and would have killed for a glass of cold water right about now. Hence, he didn't even bother asking for food. He knew his restaurant gave water for free. It was part of the policy. "I'm so sorry, miss. I was just wondering if I could get a cup of water. I've been walking for a long time and about to pass out now," he pleaded with the waitress who would have come to shoo him if she wasn't occupied with serving a customer. "I'm sorry, sir," she hissed. "We don't offer water to people who aren't customers," she regarded him with the most scathing look. But miss, you could spare just one glass." "Get lost now or I'll come out with the manager," she snarled. Well, that was a colossal failure on her part, Brandon thought to himself. Not punishable by being fired, but definitely not worth any sort of promotion either. He committed her face to his memory and looked on. He would usually have to interact with everyone in the restaurant to form a defined opinion of everyone there. For all he knew, the manager could be a kind soul. Instead of leaving, he decided to stay and bear the awkward stare of the equally arrogant customers that regarded him with more spite than a convicted criminal. "I'm Brandon," he smiled, and made a note to embarrass himself further since this was just a fake persona. None of the embarrassment went past the surface of his skin, because when he would get home in the evening, he would have a nice hot bath in a tub in his mansion. The waitress looked like she had just had a gutter rag thrown on her. "Give me a second." She smiled sweetly at the customer she was attending to and immediately hurried over to the office area of the restaurant. Brandon watched with satisfaction, knowing she was probably going to get the manager. As he stared, he looked over the counter and noticed the other workers, all staring at him with the same expression. The men looked hostile, and on the faces of the women were written nothing but pure disgust. "That's all right. Just the manager now," he thought to himself. As he looked on, one of the waitresses passed by him. She must have been inside the kitchen because he didn't see her behind the counter. What made him keep his eyes on her is the simple fact that she kept hers on him. There was not a shred of disgust on her face, not even a surprise. She just passed him and went to serve another customer, and, on her way back, she stopped by him. "Hey, can I get you anything?" she asked with a bright but concerned smile. Her honey-coloured hair had strands spilling across her face, probably roughed by all the work she had had to do from the morning till the midday, and her blue eyes were also fatigued, but there was still that smile on her face. "Hi, Jessie, get back to work, now!" A commanding voice growled from the side, snatching Brandon's attention from the face he was so lost in. The girl immediately scurried to fulfill her boss's desire, leaving Brandon to face the man whose face held anything but good intentions. "I'm so sorry to bother your fine establishment, sir, but I was just, thirsty, and if I could—" "Hold it!" The man, not past his early 40s, threw a silencing hand up, and his cruel scowl enforced his desire to have the homeless man in front of him shut up. "Look around you," he snarled. Brandon took a confused glance around the room. "Do you see anyone looking like you?" "Sir, I don't deny the fact that I don't belong here, I swear it. I would not even try to stay. I'm begging you, sir. A glass of water," he pleaded again. "I'd leave right after. There's nowhere else to go." The desperation in Brandon's eyes was now real, majorly because he really needed that glass of water. He was hoping for the goodwill of humanity, even though they treated him like trash. Humans are like that. Most of them lack basic empathy, but if they're persuaded enough, they'd budge. A lot of that caving was because it took more time and energy to drive the beggar away than to pull out $1 from their wallets, and a lot of them had their lives centered around efficiency. That was what Brandon was banking on, that it would save the manager more time and energy to just ask a waiter or waitress to get him a glass of water than it would for him to undertake the full process of driving him out. How wrong he was when he saw the man's eyes flare with disgusted indignation. "You're going to stay here, and then in 30 seconds, or after you leave, the purse of one of my customers is going to get missing. Nice try, buddy. Move before I call the cops," the man barked. Brandon was, at this point, resigned to fate, knowing that kindness had eluded the entire place. He was going to leave now, but that wouldn't quench his hunger or thirst. It had been a long morning. To that regard, Brandon reached into his pocket and fumbled. He fumbled because he had his wallet in there, still in mint condition, in case any serious altercations were to happen. At least, he could reveal his identity to the cops at the last minute. He hoped to God that he had less than a $100 bill in there. But just for good measure, he scrunched up the bill away from the sight of the manager and brought it out. It was 100. Sah! Being rich could sometimes be an inconvenience. "This is all I have. If I can get like a $10 meal and then the change, or a soda or something." He stretched the money out to the manager. Paying for his food wouldn't be an embarrassment to him now, even if he was isolated from the rest of his customers for his looks. The manager's face unfolded into more fury, which Brandon didn't think was possible since he had gone through at least 3 different stages of anger already. "Get your filth out of my restaurant now!" Each word seeped out with so much venom, Brandon would have been corroded away if words had the ability to affect the physical composition of the things they were directed to. "I can't even stand looking at you. Henry, make sure this man is on the street where he belongs. In 5 minutes, if I come out and meet him here, you'll have your job to pay," he barked and stomped off, pausing between each table to offer apologies for the grave disturbance. "No worries, Henry. I'll be on my way." Brandon smiled sadly at the youngling that was sent to usher him out. You could tell Henry didn't like the task, and Brandon wanted to save him the trouble. He made his way slowly out of the room, noting a few things that he would call later to inform the manager about. It was his steakhouse after all. The ornamental plants looked like they needed replacing a long time ago, and some lights were faulty. It irked him to think he would have to respond cordially to the man that had just treated him like trash a few moments ago. He walked out, but not far from the restaurant. He really was hungry, and even though this was his last trip, he still had a long way to go back home. He needed food. He thought of waiting till a customer tried to enter and persuading them with money to help get him something, and so he waited by the side of the building, a little towards the back, away from the direct line of sight of the manager in case he came investigating. "Hey!" a small voice called out to him after he had begun dozing against the wall. He opened his eyes to see that it was the waitress from inside, the one with brown hair that didn't look at him like he was a diseased rat, carrying the bubonic plague. "Back," she nudged towards the back of the steakhouse. "Quickly. Break isn't long, and I have to split for both of us." She had a brown paper bag in her hand that she kept in the side of her that faced away from the windows inside the restaurant in case anyone saw. Brandon crawled in desperation after her, and they were in the back of the restaurant, away from prying eyes. She opened the bag without looking at him, but that was because she seemed to be in a hurry. "I got 2 burgers," she smiled proudly. "One for each of us. We'd have to share the Sprite, though. It's difficult to sneak out more than 1 cup." She stretched, took a big gulp first, and then stretched it out to him. You know, I probably shouldn't. I'm dirty and having to share with you. Oh, I know, she gave him an assuring face. I've taken all I need. There's tap water inside that I could get full on later. Thank you. Brandon accepted the cup from her and took a large gulp. She filled the cup to the brim, so her own sip was less than a tithe of the entire thing. As rich as he was, Brandon would remember this day as the day he enjoyed a makeshift employee-styled burger. It wasn't the usual on the customer menu, and was all the things she liked. He would go as far as to critique it, and note that the patty wasn't the best, probably an older bun than he would normally condone. But to him, that moment, the meal was heaven. The gratitude shone from more than just his eyes. He thanked her with every bite. Oh, please, stop already, she tried, hiding her blush from him, but it was futile. I wasn't going to let you starve, no matter what. Why? He felt the sudden impulse to ask. Why? She responded to his question with the same words, but the meaning was clearly communicated. You should have seen your face. You were lucky you didn't pass out inside, and that shouldn't happen to anyone. She had her face set in determination. Thank you, Brandon said again, after the last bite of the burger. Done already? Yeesh. Now I feel like I should have bought 3 burgers, she chuckled and continued eating hers. She paused to offer it to him. I could get another one later. We have fast breaks and stuff. But Brandon shook his head. He was going back home to a sumptuous dinner. He just needed something to get him through the journey back. No, it's fine. You've given me more food than I've had in days, miss, he lied with a chuckle. It's Jessie. You're... Brandon. He shook the hand she extended. If you need some tomorrow, you can come. I'd get burgers for lunch, and I could work towards sneaking some food when I close work, okay? She peered out of the backyard alley they were in. I've got to get back to work now. Tomorrow? Brandon couldn't say no to that pretty smile on her face. Plus, she'd just extended his social experiment for the rest of the week. He was going to have to keep up the act. You bet, he smiled broadly. You know, for a man on the streets, you sure do have nice teeth, she commented, making Brandon aware that she saw him. She was looking at him, not just a homeless man. Brandon. I, haven't been out long. That was impartiality, a truth one that could be too easily misconstrued, as even if she had 1,000 guesses, she wouldn't think that he was the multimillionaire owner of the very establishment she worked for. Okay, Brandon, she waved and finally hurried inside. For the first time in what had to be forever, his heart fluttered. It had been a while since he experienced genuine kindness. He didn't even wait for the afternoon the next day. By around 11, Brandon was already somewhere around the restaurant. He avoided coming too close at first because he feared one of the other loathsome employees would spot him and report him to the manager, who would then call the police and end up terminating his little experiment. Hence, he waited till it was lunchtime. He didn't mind the sweltering heat of the East Coast midday. As long as there was shade and he was safe from direct contact with the sun, he was good to go. The early morning jog he had before making his way here had built up enough grime to give his dirty homeless look some glimmer, and wearing the same clothes as yesterday was spot on. After what seemed to be an eternal wait, he saw Jessie exit the building with the same brown bag as yesterday and scan for him. He immediately tossed his phone in his pocket, but not before putting it on the silent mode. If his brand new top-of-the-line smartphone rang during his interaction with her, the only way he would have been able to explain it without giving himself away would be lying that he stole it. No, that wouldn't have been a very good look on his image, and at this point, he wanted to do a little bit of impressing, no matter how limited his options were. It didn't take long for Jessie to spot him, and he waved to her as soon as she did. A smile lit her face, and she quickly beckoned him to come over. Warily, he approached his own restaurant, making sure to steer clear of any doors and windows, just in case anyone was peering through. Hey, Jessie, how's work? He greeted her with a grin. She returned the smile. Exhausting. How about you? Sleep well yesterday? I mean, I had a full stomach, so it was much better than the day before, Brandon shrugged. A burger and half a cup of Sprite does nothing to fill the stomach, she commented almost pitifully. You have no idea. Brandon replied, feeling proud of himself for playing the part of the homeless man so good. Maybe it's because he knew what it actually felt like to be hungry. "Well, I got lunch," she announced, and this time she had a cup in her hand, with one in the bag. Brandon felt a wave of satisfaction that at least she didn't have to split her lunch between the both of them again. "2 Sprites," he commented excitedly. "You don't get them both," Jessie laughed. "One's for me." "Of course." He plopped down to the ground where they had made a makeshift table with 2 empty crates and a sheet of thick cardboard. After the meal, which was mostly quiet, save for the usual banter of thank yous and don't thank me's, Jessie stood up unannounced and went to where a bigger sheet of cardboard met the wall. From it, she produced a black plastic bag. A curious Brandon turned his gaze to his new friend from his empty cup, and his eyes held the question his feigned shyness couldn't ask. "They're clothes." She smiled and brandished a pair of jeans from the bag. "And another. And another." Brandon didn't know where he got the intuition to act surprised, but he did it. "Whoa, where'd you get these?" "They're from my father. I told him about you, and he agreed to give these away." She emptied the bag, and some shirts also came out. "They're nice," he commented. From the perspective of someone homeless, these were a steal. "Of course they are." Jessie slapped him playfully on the shoulder. "My daddy has good taste." He noted how she touched him and didn't care one bit whether he was dirty or not. She was not at all irritated by him. "Just because you're homeless, it doesn't mean you should dress all washed up and dirty," she simmered into a serious mode. "The fact that you're on the streets now isn't a condemnation. You shouldn't resign to fate. You can still make it. It just needs a little help." She winked. He held the clothes tight and cherished them more than the wardrobe he had at home. Someone hadn't met him yet and wanted him to have these. The kindness felt unreal. "Hey, when I close today, you think you can follow me home and take a shower?" She placed a hand on his shoulder, touching him again. She was not afraid to look him in the eye. It gave Brandon a lot of comfort to see that if he was in this state, there would be someone that wouldn't find him completely repulsive. "Thank you, Jessie. I really mean it," he almost cried. "Oh, it's fine, really." Jessie shrugged. It was clear on her face that she understood the value of the deed she was doing, but she also didn't want to come off as too understanding or too sympathetic. She knew that coming off as too overbearing might push people away when trying to help them. And she was desperate to help this man. Why? When other people saw a filthy man that could be a thief and a wretch up to anything but good, she saw a man that could be saved. He didn't look like he was addicted to any sort of drugs, so she felt the burden of helping him lighten considerably. He'd be easy to reason with, easier to help before he got to that stage. The happiness in his eyes made her heart warm, and she could only imagine the horror he would have gone through the days before he met her, enough to consider a cheeseburger, a fitting meal for the full day. It broke her heart ever so slightly, but she kept the emotions inside and wanted to maintain the optimism that everything would be fine. She didn't want to make him feel any more hopeless than he already did, because that's probably the first step to a life destroyed beyond recovery, the thought that there's no fixing you. She didn't want that for Brandon, not while there was still time. She would have loved to stay and chat some more. Maybe get to know him on a deeper level and gain further insights on how to subtly help him, but she had work. Her break was already 5 minutes due, and if she didn't get to work soon, someone would come looking for her. "I gotta get back to work, Brandon. Will you wait for me here?" "Well, when would you be getting off?" Brandon asked with interest in his eyes, telling Jessie that he was indeed ready to be saved. "At 5. I'm on the day shift today, and I don't need to work overtime." She stood up and began backing out of the alley, seeming reluctant to leave her new friend. Mostly to her, he was like a puppy. She didn't want to come out, and he had just disappeared, only to resurface a few days later, dirty and back to square one. She wanted progress, because the faster she could help him, the better his chances would be. Brandon knew when the store would close, of course. He was just really inept with his acting, surprising even himself on his intuitive questions. However, slip-ups did occur. "Yeah, Alan better not make you stay long," he snorted, remembering his dislike for the manager. Only when he saw her face did he realize his slip. "You know the manager?" she questioned. "Everyone knows Alan around the block." He quickly covered his tracks and settled the surprise on Jessie's face. "Real meanie. Tossed an empty can of Dr. Pepper on a guy named Zed once," he spat. "Yeah, Alan is awful. I guess that's what makes him a good boss," Jessie shrugged. "A good enforcer," Brandon insisted. He wished he could just fire Alan now, but doing away with your manager for no good reason could attract a lawsuit for wrongful termination if not handled properly, especially from a man like Alan. Jessie wasn't in the mood to argue, so she just chuckled away into the restaurant where, indeed, there was glowering Alan, wondering where she might have been. Unbothered, she endured the scolds and harsh rebukes a lot easier because her mind was not on the job she had to do. Her mind was on Brandon and how she was going to make an impact in the life of one man. When she clocked off, she immediately sprinted to the backyard where she thought Brandon would be, but when she got there, she saw no one. Slight resignation set in, until she looked past her original excitement and decided to have a little look around. Not far from the backyard, Brandon leaned against a pole having a conversation with another man. The man also looked homeless, so she assumed he must be the Zed he was talking about. Not wanting to be too intrusive, she stood back and let them finish the conversation. The man Brandon was talking to wasn't Zed. He wasn't anyone Brandon really knew for that matter. But by virtue of how he was dressed, the man found someone to talk to, and Brandon gladly obliged. Getting to know the man a little more, Brandon knew that the elderly man was a man that would need some help. He would do that when his full identity would be revealed. In the meantime, he spotted Jessie waiting for him, and immediately ended his conversation with the old man, promising to stick around later. He didn't want to keep his angel of a helper waiting for long. "Zed?" she asked as soon as he got to her. "Nope. Reagan. Zed hasn't been here for a long time. I doubt he's coming back," Brandon fibbed. "Right." She fished into her bag and got a can of Dr. Pepper out. "For the road," she stretched the can to him with a smile. In real life, Brandon had resigned from refined sugars and carbonated drinks, but for his role, he was going to have to make an exception. Besides, he didn't want to make her feel like she wasn't doing enough, or that there was anything of her doing that wasn't appreciated. The journey to her house was shorter than he felt she should have needed to compensate for, less than a 30-minute walk, and they were walking on quite a leisurely pace as well, since Jessie was just that woman, knowing how to keep conversations alive, slowing time from its fleeting race to a dreamy crawl. Jessie's house was humble, a semi-detached bungalow whose mortgage her father had just finished clearing. All the rooms in the house were put to good use. One was her father's, the other was hers, and they had one spare for guests like her uncle who stopped by every now and again, as he was a travel doctor. When Brandon entered the house, a wave of nostalgia filled him. It reminded him of his own little beginnings, even though he was much more humble. "I'll show you to the shower," Jessie guided him by hand, again, displaying that she wasn't scared of contact from a scrawny man she knows nothing of but his name. "Dad is probably sleeping by now, so we shouldn't make too much noise." Brandon's eyes widened. "Your dad is home?" "Uh-huh. His legs aren't the best anymore, so his job in construction, you know. Kinda dipped," she told him with a sad gleam in her eyes. "Oh, I'm sorry." Brandon didn't know what to say. "Huh." She brushed off the dreamy look on her face. "It's cool. Just go take a shower. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me," she said. She left him to do his thing, and after checking up on her father, she dived into the preparation of the dish. It was her father's favourite, and she hoped Brandon liked it too. It didn't take too long for Brandon to shower, and that worried Jessie, because before he entered the kitchen, she could perceive the freshness coming from him. However, as soon as he stepped into the kitchen, she was reminded that he was homeless. Not retarded or having trouble with any life-threatening addiction of any sort. Simply homeless, and it showed. "Wow," was all she could utter. Brandon sure knew how to make a dad golf shirt look good on him. She didn't know what homeless men worked out this much, or looked this good. Everything about his homelessness vanished, and in its place stood the aura of a demigod. He looked down at himself and made minor adjustments and stretches, showing off his toned muscles and making butterflies pool at her belly. The trousers seemed a little oversized at the waist, but he already had a belt on him, so he was able to keep it on his waist. All cleaned up, she shook the intruding thoughts out of her head and managed to say. He smiled and showed off his perfect dentition, bringing his clean look to a complete circle. "Thanks to you," he replied. "I'm done with the gravy. Do you like it with rice or cornbread?" "Anything, honestly. I'll have the gravy itself if I could," he chuckled. It actually smelled good, and the only thing that stopped him from going close enough to peer into the pan and soak up all the aroma was the respect he had for her and the reservation he was supposed to keep up. She laughed. "Cornbread it is, you'll love the dinner." As they enjoyed each other's silence, there was the dull sound of rolling against the wooden floorboard that Jessie knew all too well. Only Brandon had to turn to check it out. "Hey, Dad," Jessie called without looking back as she was really invested in the dinner she was making. "Good evening, Mr. Jessie's dad." Brandon stepped back and allowed the smiling man to roll into the kitchen. He wasn't too elderly, so there was still a lot of black on his already balding hair. Jessie was a spitting image of her father, and the warm, accepting smile on his face showed that the fruit doesn't fall too far from the tree. There was absolutely no look of animosity on his face whatsoever. "Ah, you must be Brandon. Handsome lad you are," he grinned. "It's me, sir." "I really appreciate the clothes." Brandon shyly showed the man his limbs where the clothes rested, to which the man simply smiled. "I'm glad. At least the clothes are actually being put to good use. They finally fit someone better than they do me," he laughed cheerily, his middle-aged face creasing and wisdom lines spreading over his eyes. "They're the best things I've worn in a while," Brandon replied with good nature. "I'm sorry about the things you might have had to go through. You know, out there. It's a cold world, and the government is even colder to its people, but it's a phase. People have passed it. You will too." Brandon nodded as Jessie's father admonished him. "I can see the fight in your eyes. It's not over." "Heck, it's not over for me, and I'm in a wheelchair." He laughs. The room became way less tense as giggles erupt, and the light atmosphere is carried into the dining room where they all have a happy meal. Not once did Jessie's father ask about anything that led to his homelessness, which was a relief because Brandon had nothing planned. He didn't think he would get this far into the homelessness lore and so didn't feel the need to come up with a backstory. Jessie's dad, Hugh, was full of stories about his own rough beginnings, and even though Brandon's reality was a stark opposite of what he made it out to be, he actually did learn a thing or two about determination, happiness, and everything in between. He also understood the backbone of the love Jessie harboured in her heart. It came from her mother, who had been late since she was 10 and was an excellent role model to her daughter, up until cancer thought all that love was too much for one little girl. After the dinner, Jessie insisted on seeing Brandon off, but she already had a plan for him in that regard. "So, Jessie," Brandon forgot his shyness, feeling like he slowly didn't need it anymore. Maybe it was the new clothes. "Tell me about your mother," he implored the beautiful girl by his side. She swished her brown hair to the side and smiled a little as the memories began flowing back in tiny little details. "She was beautiful," Jessie smiled. "Like you," Brandon thought to himself. He wished he could say things like that out loud. He wished they had that kind of relationship. "She was kind too. I remember she taught me everything I know and think about people today. She always said never to judge people by what they look like on the outside. The most beautiful plants have the thorniest insides, and in the ugliest of flowers, you could get the sweetest nectar," she recounted, saying it with practiced carefulness in a way that Brandon knew she was quoting her mother. "She sounds like an angel," he sighed. "I wish I had knowledge of my parents." "You don't know them?" Jessie looked concerned. Brandon shook his head. They died while I was young, so I kinda... He simply shrugged and left the rest to her imagination. The poor, compassionate girl's mind did run wild, thinking about all the hell he must have gone through all the way till now. No one deserves to lose their parents at that age. She shook her head and wrapped a comforting arm around him. Hey, you might have blown your shot at my restaurant since, Alan hates you and stuff. But you think you could apply for a job elsewhere? I mean, it's a good start, don't you think? She let the suggestion simmer in his head for a little while, and luckily for her, Brandon wasn't someone that needed extra convincing. He always accepted her opinions with an open heart and a willingness that gladdened her. You're right. I mean, now that I look like this, I could get a job as a janitor or a construction worker. Then I don't have to be a bother to anyone, ever. The broad smile on his face sent her to the moon and back with joy. Yes, she backed him up. You know my house has a guest room. You could always come over for a place to sleep and shower. My dad would be more than happy. Brandon's eyes widened. Are you really suggesting that I come... Live with us, yeah. It's the least I could do. Besides, we're not paying rent or mortgage, so you don't have to feel like you're owing anything, okay? My God, you're an angel. I swear it. You're an angel. He gasped in disbelief. Was she being so incredibly nice because it was her nature, or was she just being intuitive trying to tackle actual problems? Why are you so kind? He was the one holding her now, feeling like she really was an angel and would fly away any second if he let her stray too far from her. She simply shrugged, thinking of another generic answer to give. In truth, Jessie saw no philosophical reason to be kind to people other than it being the right thing to do. In reality, that was what it was. It could be logical, it could be empathetic, but above all, it was just right. And that's why she did things for people like offer them her home, even though society would dictate otherwise. I would have loved to take you up on that offer, Jessie, but I have a friend. He's not living well, but I can stay with him now that, I'm clean and all. You've done so much for me already. He took her hands in his and breathed his air of gratitude into them as he kissed the back of her palms. I'll come and see you as soon as I get settled down, all right? He told her. Jessie was naturally skeptical about him staying away from her for a while since she wanted to supervise his progress, but it was a suggestion she couldn't say no to. So, she agreed. Be safe for me, Brandon, and remember that job thing I told you about, she told him as she began backing in the direction of her house. My friend might have some ideas. Brandon nodded. I'll see you soon, Jessie, he waved goodnight to her. Good night. Not goodbye. Brandon got home feeling like a homeless man that was just taken care of. Well, that was in fact what he was, but getting home he was supposed to shrug off that life. He didn't want to. He didn't want to forget Jessie so easily. In fact, he was sure he had found the right person for the job and left to him, he would have just put the entire thing to closure, however. Apart from the respect that he had for Jessie and the commendation, something else was brewing inside of him for the young waitress, something he hadn't felt for a long time. Brandon wasn't necessarily a lonely man, but romantic relationships had always been difficult for him because every now and again the women in his life managed to prove that they were after him for his money. Now, he might have found it in the person of sweet, sweet Jessie. Brandon gave it a few days before he went to her again, still wearing other of the clothes he gave her. They met at their usual spot in the back of the restaurant. That's wonderful! She smiled excitedly at the pseudo-news of Brandon getting a job and wholeheartedly refused a few dollars he tried to give her. The things I did for you are not to be paid back or refunded, Brandon. She sounded a bit offended that he would think of her like that, but Brandon anticipated this. That was the setup for the request he made next. Then let me take you on a date. Jessie. Just to say thank you. Would you let me? Thanks to you. I'm off the streets. I have to thank you in some way. He spread his arms in plea. The smile that creeped onto her face was gradual, but it came. She couldn't deny that the once homeless man is now a really handsome man now. And she couldn't deny the butterflies his smile made her feel. "Okay, mister, you're picking the place and time," she slapped his shoulders playfully. "You bet." Brandon concealed his mischief with a smirk. Evening came and Jessie was outside in a sundress, waiting for her date. He wasted not a second more than the allotted 7 p.m., pulling up in a taxi. The flowers he had in his hands left the cab before he did, and he held out his hands for her to take before slowly pulling her into the car. He then offered her the rose bouquet that she questioned its price, but he told her not to worry. He had picked them from his personal garden, but she didn't need to know that yet. "No way!" she gasped with the hint of a smile playing across her lips when the taxi stopped. "I thought, novelty's sake that we came here. It was where we met." Brandon shrugged. For him, this was the final test. Not for Jessie. He had already concluded everything about the angel, and if she actually insisted they go somewhere else, he would oblige. But he would try to convince her to enter. He wanted to give Alan and the others a chance to redeem themselves from their undiluted wickedness, especially Alan, the manager of the place. He needed a reason not to fire the guy, and this would have to be it. "Brandon, it's just super weird is all. Aren't you worried Alan would recognize you?" she asked, concerned. "Are you worried Alan would recognize you?" Brandon threw the question back to her. She rolled her eyes and exhaled. "Alan doesn't worry me. Losing my job does. And since I'm off work hours, he can kiss dirt if he tries anything stupid," she declared boldly. "Well then," Brandon opened his arm for her to link. "Shall we?" The both of them walked into the restaurant, ready for what the steakhouse and its staff had in store for them. They settled down, and the first person to attend to them was the waitress that Brandon met first when he came in. She had a nice smile on her face that immediately vanished as soon as she recognized him. "Jessie, what's this?" she asked in a blank, unimpressed tone. "What do you mean, Lillian? Aren't you going to take our order?" Jessie threw back. From the exchange, Brandon could tell that the both of them didn't have a nice history. That checked out. Surely, a girl as cruel as Lillian would never validate the empathetic opinions of Jessie. "Well, what do you want? Leftovers?" She rolled her eyes and scoffed. "You even came here on a date. You should have seen where my boyfriend took me. We spent $400 on the food alone," she rambled about her exotic life. But all that was on Jessie's face was disgust. That was the first time Brandon saw an expression on Jessie that didn't reflect kindness. It was because she didn't tolerate the vain obtuseness that spewed out of the mouth of her co-worker. "Get us the 14-ounce spiced ribeye steak, medium rare, and Greek salad. If I could have a linguine on the side as well, I'm a little bit indecisive." He glanced at Jessie, who had her jaw slightly ajar from how he just recited items from their menu offhand. "Marinara on the linguine, please." He winked at Jessie, who still looked stunned. "Whatever. We'll have to place someone on watch. Make sure y'all don't run off or anything," Lillian rolled her eyes. "It'll come out of your pay anyways. And you'll be fired for theft." Jessie did a mean, childish imitation of what the embittered woman sounded like before sending her off with a scathing order. "Just do your job, Lillian." She then turned to Brandon with a glower. "What was that? And how are you going to pay for all those?" "Relax, darling," Brandon eased with a sly smile. "I had a life before I became homeless. This isn't my first time in a restaurant. If prices differ by no more than $10, everything should total around $100. "That's still a lot of money," she huffed. "It's too little compared to what you deserve," Brandon insisted. As they bantered over the price and responsible spending, a cackle sifted into the room, and as they turned their heads, it was clear who the laughter was from and who it was for. "Don't tell me this girl actually wanted to mock me this badly." "Jessie," Alan sighed as he approached the table. "What are you now? The revenge attorney for homeless people? Or are you genuinely dating a homeless drug addict?" "Neither," Brandon growled. "Where's our food?" "My words still stand, sir," the manager snarled at Brandon. "We do not serve criminals, and we certainly do not tolerate them sitting on our chairs." "You know what, Brandon? Let's just go to another place. Jessie stood up and snatched her purse from the table, but Brandon remained stoic. He had had enough of the bullying and disrespect that was being dished out by a man under his payroll simply because he thought he was better than someone less fortunate than him. He was ready to reveal his true identity right there and then. And he was about to reach into his pocket and fish out his business card when Jessie's hand pulled him firmly as Alan continued to scathe. "Let's go, Brandon. It's never worth it." Jessie gave Alan one last deathly look before the pair stormed out of the restaurant. Mission failed, successfully. They didn't let the actions of Alan spoil their night, though, and it was a solid opportunity for Jessie to insist that they don't spend so much. None of those things mattered to Brandon at this point, so he let her have his way. His verdict was concluded. His limit was reached. It was time for the CEO to emerge. A few days after their date, Jessie woke up to the doorbell ringing over and again. She was hoping that the ringer would go away, but stood up immediately. The thought that it could be Brandon crossed her mind. Sure enough, it was Brandon. She took a wide step back. She didn't remember giving him a suit, and not something this fancy. She wouldn't have recognized him if she hadn't spent so much time with him. "Brandon, how did you... She stuttered. His beauty struck her dumb. She didn't know whether to be impressed or surprised, so her body picked the most natural reaction for her. "I went to the restaurant twice." "I didn't see you. What happened?" Brandon let himself into the house, the strong scent of overpowering, expensive musk flowing with him. Jessie didn't understand it. Neither did her father. "I see you grew out of those clothes so fast." Hugh tried to hide his surprise under jokes. "I actually have them framed on my wall, Hugh. They belong to a special moment in time when a certain man showed me more kindness than I deserved." Brandon smiled and gave a confused Hugh a pat on the back. He then turned back to Jessie. "Hey, are you sick? Is something wrong?" "No, I quit, Brandon. I couldn't go back to that place again. I couldn't look at Alan and not say something stupid. I just thought it was better to quit," she confessed, with her head hung low, but then she perked up again. "I did manage to tell him my mind before I left, though." That was for certain. Brandon smiled. This was going to be an even more elaborate revelation than he thought. "I'll be on the lookout for more opportunities. The 3 days I've been away from work already got me a little bored," she chuckled. "Oh, if you're desperate, then I know a place they're hiring. Want to check it out?" Brandon asked. Her eyes lit up with hope. If she could get hired immediately, it would be a blessing in this economy. The thought of having to deal with tons of rejection gave her shivers. "Was that where you got your suit?" She raised her brows and smiled with one side of her face. Brandon thought about the irony of that question for a second, before replying with an even more mischievous grin. "Yes. Yes, it is." "Let me throw on something more comfortable. If you need to wear a suit, who knows what I would have to wear?" She sprinted into her room, leaving Brandon with Hugh. He gave Brandon some friendly tips on the work sector that the young man took with good nature, despite the fact that by the time he would be back with his daughter, the entire narrative would have changed, and in a good way. As soon as Jessie left the house, she walked past the sleek Mercedes parked in the walkway and just moved past, not caring who had it. It never mattered. In actuality, she could call the cops and insist the vehicle be moved from in front of her property, but what good would that do? She turned back when Brandon hadn't reached her side. Was he still saying goodbye to her father? No. Brandon was beside the beautiful car that she had just passed, and it was now open in the driver's seat. His hands held the door open. "Huh? You're going to get in?" He smiled, enjoying the shock on her face. "Brandon, what's—" "I'll explain on the way, I promise," he told her, and that was able to get her to move her limbs towards the car. On the drive, he explained everything to her. Most of it, that is. He didn't tell her about the restaurant being his and the experiment he was conducting. Brandon had planned this way too well to spill the tea so easily. He gazed out of the window, lost in a memory that was as vivid as if it had happened just yesterday. Brandon was 8 years old. He and his grandmother lived in a small, quaint house near the local steakhouse. The scent of sizzling steaks often filled the air, teasing his senses and making his mouth water. His grandmother, Mrs. Harper, was a kind and loving woman who did her best to provide for him after his parents' tragic accident. They managed, but money was always tight. One evening, as the rich, savoury smell of cooking steak drifted through the open window, Brandon's stomach growled. He turned to his grandmother, who was knitting in her favourite chair. "Grandma, do you think we could ever afford to eat at the steakhouse?" he asked, his voice full of hope. Mrs. Harper looked up from her knitting, her eyes filled with love and sadness. "Maybe one day, dear. But for now, we need to save every penny we can." Brandon nodded, understanding the weight of her words. But the craving for that delicious steak gnawed at him. He decided he had to do something about it. The next day, Brandon gathered all the courage he could muster and walked into the steakhouse. The rich aroma hit him full force, making his stomach rumble even louder. He approached the counter where the manager, Mr. Scott, stood. Mr. Scott was a tall, kind-looking man with greying hair and a warm smile. "Hello, young man. How can I help you today?" Mr. Scott asked, leaning down to meet Brandon's eye level. "Hi, sir. My name is Brandon," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I was wondering if I could get a steak on credit. I promise I'll work to pay it back." Mr. Scott's smile faded a bit as he looked at the earnest boy in front of him. He knew Brandon's story. Everyone in the neighborhood did. He sighed and gestured for Brandon to follow him to a quieter corner of the restaurant. "Brandon," Mr. Scott started gently, "I know times are tough for you and your grandmother, and I admire your willingness to work for what you want. But today, I'm afraid I can't give you a steak on credit." Brandon's heart sank. He had hoped so much that this plan would work. "But why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Scott placed a comforting hand on Brandon's shoulder. "Because, Brandon, sometimes the best way to help someone is by not giving them what they want right away. It makes them stronger and more determined. If you really want that steak, go out, find a way to earn some money and come back. It'll taste even better knowing you worked for it." Tears welled up in Brandon's eyes, but he nodded. "Okay, sir, I understand." Mr. Scott smiled warmly. "I believe in you, Brandon. You'll find a way." Brandon smiled at the memory. That day had been a turning point for him. Mr. Scott's words had lit a fire in his heart. He had gone out, done odd jobs around the neighborhood, saved every penny, and eventually returned to the steakhouse with enough money to buy that coveted steak. And it had indeed tasted better than he could have ever imagined. When they stopped in front of the steakhouse, Jessie's jaw dropped for what had to be the 100th time. "No!" she gasped as they came out, already caught on to the plot. "Yup, this is mine," he smiled proudly and began the confident strut into the restaurant. Alan was out of his office, berating a worker ever so lightly when he stepped in. Everyone paused what they were doing. Seeing Jessie with the rich-looking man, Alan had the best guess, especially since he had seen Brandon a couple of times. "What? You dressed your doll in a tux and now you're here to play house? I'm busy. Take a seat. You'll be served, if that's what you want," he snorted. Brandon guessed he finally got tired and decided to give them whatever they wanted. This should have happened on the very first day when he came in as a homeless man. "Alan Connaught, is that right?" The calling of his full name hit the brakes in Alan's head. The voice of authority had his heart pumping faster than a sports car's pistons. "Brandon Jericho, CEO of Jericho Steakhouse." He pulled his business card from his pocket and stretched it out to the man who was still in disbelief, laughed and walked all the way to retrieve the card from his hands. The more he read, the more in shock he was. "You were interviewed by Jonas High, the managing director. He resigned last week, about the same time I set out on this social experiment." He regarded all the other staff in the area whose eyes were glued open and mouths frozen shut. "A social experiment that every of my other branches failed, but this branch failed woefully. And this manager..." Alan looked like he was either about to pass out or was already out cold, just standing. You treated staff and customers horribly, consistently, Brandon meted out his verdict. Pack your stuff and be out before it gets too busy and everyone has to see your embarrassment. A few customers gasped, but no one interfered. It was midday, so the place wasn't full. Jericho was usually packed at lunchtime and through the evenings. Alan hung his head low in shame and shuffled along. He had no defense. He couldn't even muster the shamelessness to plead for mercy. Lillian, you work your last month here and turn in your resignation as well, Brandon commanded. Same offence as your boss? Ex-boss. Lily also uttered not a word. How could she? What would she have said? To Jessie, he was an entirely different person now. The small voice was replaced by domineering nonchalance. She felt chills run down her spine, knowing she was on the good side of such power. Everyone, meet your new managing director. Brandon took Jessie's hand and lifted it in the air. All the customers cheered, forcing the staff to a reluctant cheer. Jessie herself was stunned. Brandon then leaned in to whisper to her, "And my girlfriend, if she will accept by giving me a simple nod?" When he stepped back, tears filled Jessie's eyes as she nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, Brandon," she jumped into his arms and held him close. Now, all her help might have felt inconsequential with his revelation, but Brandon knew one thing. She helped him into love. Genuine love. Jessie looked around and stretched her hands to someone among the staff. A middle-aged woman emerged and welcomed the embrace of her young friend. "She's worked here the longest," Jessie told Brandon with a smile. "And she helped me sneak lunch to you the second time you came. The Dr. Pepper was also hers. I think she can run this place. You know, saving you the need for an interview." "Good, you're the new manager. Think you can handle it?" He looked into her name tag. "Helen." Yes, sir." The eyes of the janitor lit up. "It's mundane stuff, mostly. Anything you can't do, delegate. But if something goes wrong, I'll ask you questions. Got it?" He extended a fist for her to bump. "Yes, sir." She bumped his fist, almost tearing up at the insane turn of events, and Jessie smiled. The circle was complete. Brandon was sure his company and heart were in the safest of hands. Jessie walked into her home that day and announced to her father that she was going to continue working for the steakhouse. Hugh looked empathetic. He knew his daughter was doing her best to keep food on the table for them both. "Jessie, you don't have to do this," Hugh said gently. "I'm ready to starve if needed, but I won't allow you to work in such conditions." Just then, Brandon appeared from behind. He greeted Hugh warmly and said, "Mr. Kirby, you can go ahead and congratulate your daughter on becoming the new manager at my steakhouse." Hugh was utterly confused. He looked at his daughter, searching for answers. Jessie smiled and explained, "Dad, Brandon isn't just any homeless man. He's actually the owner of the steakhouse." Brandon approached Hugh and placed his hands on Hugh's shoulders. "Thank you for raising such a kind daughter," Brandon said sincerely. "From today on, you don't have to worry about her. I'll be there for her. Mr. Kirby, may I have your blessing to protect your daughter and be her man?" Hugh turned to Jessie, who had tears of joy in her eyes. He looked back at Brandon and asked, "So you've been the boss all along, Brandon?" Brandon nodded, his grin spreading. "I had to be sure she was the one. Not just for the job, but for me," he confessed, looking lovingly at Jessie. Jessie blushed, her eyes sparkling with happiness and relief. The room filled with laughter and warm conversation as they discussed plans for the future. The evening passed quickly, with stories shared and plans made, until it was time for Brandon to leave. The months flew by, and the wedding day arrived just as suddenly. The ceremony was beautiful, set in a small chapel adorned with flowers and soft music playing in the background. Hugh, dressed in his best suit, took his place in the front row, his eyes moist as he watched his daughter walk down the aisle. Jessie, radiant in her white gown, walked confidently towards Brandon, who stood waiting with an adoring smile. As they exchanged vows, Hugh felt a profound sense of joy and gratitude. His little girl was starting a new chapter in her life, one filled with love and new responsibilities. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and celebrated, Hugh approached Brandon, clapping him on the shoulder. "Take good care of her," he said, his voice steady but emotional. Brandon nodded, clasping Hugh's hand. "With all my heart," he assured. As the evening drew to a close, Hugh stood alone for a moment, watching the young couple laughing and dancing. He wiped a tear from his eye, knowing that Jessie was embarking on a wonderful journey. In her happiness, he found his own peace, reminded once again of the power of kindness and the unexpected paths it